am Geraldine Nussbaum Barrett, and this is September 2nd, 2005. And I'm sitting in the living room of my son, Bruce Barrett, in Missoula, Montana. And Bruce asked me to talk about some of my early life. And I'm going to do the best I can. Don't know where to go next.
Well, you've got a picture at your feet.
Oh, yeah. I'm the widow of John Barrett. This is John Barrett, my husband, who died 2 years ago. As you see, he was beautiful. Is that long enough?
Yeah, that's good, but you don't need to say things like, is that long? Since, you know, Mom, you're now entering your 8th decade. You've lived 8 decades, and I thought maybe it would be fun today to talk a little bit about your life in decades. Now, you were born in 1919, and I'd like you to say that on the tape. But if you think about it, your first decade was 1919 to 1929. I know that was the period of the Great Depression. I know that World War I had ended. I know that you were living back east. But why don't you talk about it and start out by saying my first decade was... So go ahead.
My first decade was I'm remembering my childhood. And I lived in New Haven, Connecticut, where I was born on October 27th, 1919. And it was a pretty traumatic time because we had a war going on. And my folks were very young and working hard, short time. And then my dad found work. He was a piano player and an orchestrator and a composer, just starting out in his 20s. And he found work, and gradually we went to New York. New Haven was a small city for music. So the first place I remember living was in the Roosevelt Apartments in the Bronx. And there was a huge statue of President Roosevelt with a big lion at his feet that he had just shot. And we were there, and I went to kindergarten there. And then we went on, and my dad got more and more work. And we moved then to Flushing, New York, and then eventually they bought a home in Bayside, Long Island, which was very lovely. In the meantime, my mother became ill. When we moved to our new house in Bayside, she was gravely ill. She had cancer. And she was away at this place and that, getting treatments, and didn't do well. And actually, she died in 1929, and that was pretty bad. I was pretty young. I had my brother, Jay, 5 years younger than I am, and my sister, who was about 2 years younger than Jay. So we were a big family, and my dad just wasn't able to cope without, he just wasn't able to cope. He had a very bad time.
Do you remember when your mother actually died?
Yes.
What was it like at that time?
I didn't go to the funeral. I saw her. We all went to see her the last time in the hospital. And it was so sad because she knew she was seeing us for the last time. And my sister was just little. She was only 2. And she just sat on the floor and put her hand up, and my mother held her hand as she sat there. And we didn't realize that was the last time we would see her, but it was. I didn't go to the funeral. They didn't always take children to funerals then. But she was in a hospital in New York, and she's buried in New York at a Jewish cemetery. And of course, I haven't been there because we've been away from there for so long.
What are your memories of her, and what was your mother like, and what was her name?
Oh, my mother's name was Esther Goldstein, who then married Joseph Nussbaum. My mother was a very scintillating type of person. I remember her, she was a singer. As a matter of fact, she sang briefly at the Metropolitan in the choir. And I remember how, well, she was just breathtaking to me. And she used to sing to me when she'd put me to sleep, and that's a nice memory. It was one song called Mighty Like a Rose. It's very pretty, she used to sing, and several others. Anyway, it probably didn't, it didn't hit me as hard as it did my baby sister, who was just left. She had no one. My dad did what he could, and Jay, he was pretty young too. He was 5. So it was a bad time for us all. We had moved into our new house in Bayside. It was formerly owned by a man that was a business manager of Florence Ziegfeld. It was a very grand house at the time, although now it doesn't look so grand. But it was big, and I remember my mother putting on my dad's big sweater and getting out and shoveling snow. She was very pretty, blue eyes and dark hair and a fair skin, and she charmed everybody she met. That's about what I remember of my mother.
Now, during that first decade, did you have much exposure to your mother's family, and who were all the characters, and when did you see them, and how did you see them?
Oh yes, I had lots of exposure. They used to let me go up to New Haven and stay with my grandmother, who was living with one son, an unmarried son, and I was there all the time. And then I had an Uncle Sam that lived on Long Island, and he used to drive to New Haven. It was only 70 miles to New Haven from New York. So it wasn't a very long trip, but they would put me on the train with a tag on my coat to wear my name and where I was going. And I made it through okay. Can't do that nowadays, but anyway, it was a warm family. We always went there for holidays. And Grandma Goldstein was very religious and very sweet. She was like a little pigeon. She was not very plump, just a little bit, and had sparkling blue eyes. And I guess all the blue eyes came from her, and freckles. All the uncles had those. So we were with them quite a bit. I had 4 uncles and 3 aunts. Counting my mother, yeah. So it was a warm family, and I have very happy memories. When I was little.
Tell me about the place. What do you know about the place where your real mother is buried? And what was her full name? If somebody ever wanted to find it, I wonder how they would do it.
Well,
do you know the city the cemetery was in?
Well, it's in New York, but I don't know what part. Although I'm not sure. I should find that out. It would be her full name, I suppose, Esther Goldstein Nussbaum, probably. I'm thinking of Bethel, but maybe that was the hospital. I'm not sure.
Well, were you hanging around your own neighborhood and your own synagogue when she died? Was the funeral in her own synagogue?
I can't tell you that. I didn't go. I don't know, but I just remember crowds of people and all the relatives there. I wish I could remember the name of the hospital. I should look at my dad's diary, but it seems to have ended when he got out of the Army and married my mother. And believe it or not, I was born 9.5 months after they married. That was a nice memory. So I think I had the best of both worlds. They were both beautiful, healthy people.
Now, during this period of your first 10 years, what was your schooling like? First of all, did you get any education before you started formal school? And then when you started school, what was it public schools? Was it Jewish schools? Was it a mix of both? Talk about your schooling.
Okay. I went to kindergarten in New York before we moved, and started school in Flushing. Flushing is a suburb of Long Island, the North Shore, about 20 miles from Bayside, where we moved. And I went to kindergarten and then started school, but I recall mostly my schooling in Bayside. And we had a pretty nice sized class, but there were only a few Jews in my class, because I went to Hebrew school after school. And my teacher, Mr. Karp, isn't that a name? Mr. Karp was very strict and very stern, but there were only about 5 or 6 children in that class. And I learned Hebrew more or less, probably less. But it was kind of fun. I enjoyed the kids, and we used to play tricks on the teacher, of course. And then I went to grade school at PS 41, which was in Bayside. And I used to get on my bike and ride across a big field that was about 2 blocks long, and my school was at the other end. We lived on a lovely residential street, and the homes were all lovely. They were built up on banks, and lots of flowers and trees, and it was a big lot we were on. And I liked school. I don't remember much about teachers or anything, but I had a good time. And we used to play games, and I had an accident in the schoolyard one day, chasing around on my bike. I was a little bit wild, and I fell and I hit my knee and opened up a big hole in my knee. I have a big scar there today. And of course the doctor had to be sent for and stitched it up at home. And it's a terrible scar, but I don't pay any attention to it. But I remember at the time how worried I was with that needle coming at me. Dr. Persoff was his name. Now, what do you think of that, remembering him? He was a nice man. We used to hide from him sometimes, because later on, when I had scarlet fever and I was quarantined with a sheet over my door in Bayside, my brother and sister would run out and hide every which where. If the doctor was coming, he used to give shots to prevent it. I don't know if they were anything good or not, but that's one of the childhood memories I have. And that about covers things. I could talk about a lot more incidents.
Were you aware of, this was the period when right when you were about 10 and when your mother died is when the Great Depression began. Do you have any memories of that, or what it was all about?
Oh, yes.
Talking about it?
Yes, I do. First of all, we had no mother in the house. We had a succession of maids that took care of us and took care of this and that in the house, and Jay was always playing tricks on the maids. We had a fat Emma and a skinny Emma, I remember. And there was a depression, but we didn't know it. My dad was very busy working and making very good money. And he used to send money to New Haven to my grandma Goldstein, who had no income. I don't know how she ever raised her family without an income. Oh, yes, I do. She sold a lot of property and things they'd had. They were pretty well-to-do, and she had to gradually lose all that. But anyway, my dad would send money there to help, and my uncles were half employed and half not there, so he helped everyone in the family. I know he used to send Grandma $100 a month, and in the Depression, that was pretty much. So we used to go into New York once in a while, great while for something, and I would see 5 apple vendors on every block trying to get a nickel an apple, and they were beautiful big red apples. And I remember, well, I can't remember when Prohibition was. That was in the next, wasn't it? because I know they used to have liquor in our house, because now I'm going back a year before my mother died or so. They entertained very much, lavishly. They'd have people for dinners and drinks, and they used to go out to Great Neck and around by the water and get illegal liquor. Boats would come there, and you could, if you knew somebody, you could go and get some liquor. Anyway, so I didn't know much about the Depression. We lived very nicely. We had help in the house, plenty to eat and drink and everything else. We didn't own a car, but you didn't need one. You just got on the Long Island Railroad if you wanted to go in. So that's about all I remember. I know a lot of the friends were very poor. We had friends that, Albert and Adele, Gloria, that were vaudevillians, and they were a wonderful pair. They did a lot of acting and dancing on the stage, and they were so poor. And they had a big green Rolls Royce that was parked in their yard. It was up on horses because they couldn't fix it and they couldn't afford to run it. So they used public transportation too. We had a good bus system out to Bayside. So that's about all I know about the Depression, except that my uncles, one by one, left in the next few years and went to California. One uncle had gone out there and was doing pretty well, my Uncle Dave. He wasn't the oldest uncle, but he was up near there. So let's see, I'm trying to remember what. Then gradually they went out west. My Uncle Dave went, then my Uncle Izzy went. He had been a printer and had a very good business in New Haven, but the Depression, and he couldn't stay in business, so he went and he got a very fine job with a big company. I think it was named Jeffries, that used to make the, what do you call those, government bonds and things. And then Louis went out, Uncle Louis, and Uncle Harry. He used to be a salesman. We used to laugh at him, call him, he sold ladies' underwear, so he had plenty of jokes about him. So finally, all the brothers were out in California, except one, my Uncle Dave, who, I won't say how he was. He wasn't, he was like Martha, my husband's aunt. He couldn't express himself well, but he wasn't what you call people when they're dumb. Anyway, he lived with my grandma, and a good thing, you know, it was company, and he took care of her, walked with her. So she had to live near a shul because she couldn't ride anywhere on the holy days and on the Sabbath.
So starting in 1930 you started your second decade, and this is when you're 10, 11 years old, going through when you're 20 and 21. Those must have been pretty big years.
Yes.
You gotta think about those years. They're basically the 1930s. At the beginning of the 1930s, were you still living in the same place, and where was that?
Oh yes, we were still living in the 1930s. We were living in Bayside, and we lived there until we took off for California. And it was very nice. Things were much the same. I went to Flushing High School, and they make fun of that name now, but we were, for 3 or 4 years in a row, we were city champions in football. So I went there, and then besides that, I took dancing, tap and ballet lessons, I took French lessons, I took art lessons. I don't know why they were educating me so furiously, but they were. My dancing teacher's name was Mrs. Westcott. I remember a lot of those things, but life was pretty good. The only trouble I had, I was wearing glasses finally. I developed, I was cross-eyed. So they took me to some fine doctor in the Bronx who had a big reputation, and he was good. He said, I'm going to cure your cross eyes, and then he said later, when you get to be a little older and you're a young lady, you can just take your glasses and throw them out of the third-story window. And so he did. He cured me. And I started to be a little social, and I liked to play with the boys and have a good time. It was nice. Life was a lot of fun. When first I went to Flushing High School, and Flushing is about 20 miles from Bayside. So I would get on a bus and make the trip. So I had a bus to school every morning and then bus home every afternoon, and my street was about 4 or 5 blocks up from the bus stop, which was on Northern Boulevard. And it was nice. There were a few other kids that did that too. And then lo and behold, they decided to build a high school in Bayside, which hadn't had one. And they called it the first $1 million high school. It was beautiful. I remember the doors were leather going into the auditorium. The floor was beautiful. I don't know. There were a lot of well-to-do people lived then on the North Shore and around there. Now it's pretty run down. It's not like it used to be. Anyway, I went to the first class that they had there. I started the first year. And I would have finished there except that we moved. And I couldn't. I had to finish out in California. So in the meantime, I've skipped too much because my father remarried. And he married my mother's younger sister, Clara Goldstein, who was a flapper and cute as a button. She wore short skirts, smoked cigarettes, and had seems like a million bows around her because she was one of those people. You know, she was so cute. And she came to live with us. She was quite young and inexperienced for family. So I figure, I don't know exactly, but she was somewhere in her early 20s. And I think it was quite a chore to take on 3 children. I know it must have been because I've raised children too, and it is. So, but she was, I have memories of her when I was a baby, and she'd climb into my crib and tell me stories and sing me to sleep. She always had a soft spot for me. Well, I was the only baby for a long time in the family. My uncles, they were all silly about me, which is nice. It gave me a lot of confidence, which I've kept to this day. And they talk about washing my diapers, etc. Anyway, when Clara came to live, things changed. We had a regular person living in the house taking care of us. And I suppose she did the best she could. She was good in some ways, and she didn't know how to cope with us in other ways. And she became very, well, how would you say? I don't want to say military, but she set down rules, and we were supposed to follow them. And of course, Jay and I were older, so we would find ways to circumvent those rules and not let her know. And poor Joy, she was at a loss because she was little, and I think she missed having a mother to cuddle her. Clara wasn't the cuddling kind, not with us. When she got older, she used to cuddle the grandchildren, but anyhow, we grew, and things went on the same. And I went to Bayside High School, and I finished 3 years, or almost 3 years. Yeah, 3 years. And my dad wanted us to wait until break in school so we could get on the train. Oh, I forgot to tell you, he had gone out to California first.
How did that happen?
Well, he was working around New York and doing lots of radio work. And the radio business was gradually moving to the West Coast because the programs were beginning to have movie stars there and celebrities that they didn't have in New York. A lot of the entertainment business went out west. Not the stage, but the rest of it, radio. And so my dad had done a show in New York with Billy Rose. It was called Jumbo, and it was at the Hippodrome, and it was quite a show. Jimmy Durante was in it. He was the lead, and Donald Novus. Donald Novus was a romantic lead. Anyway, whenever I was there, I used to run out and get a corned beef sandwich for Billy Rose. He'd throw me a bill and say, "Kid, will you go get me a corned beef on rye? Lots of mustard." So I used to do that. I don't think he knew who I was, but anyway, my dad did the music for that, and it was a success. And from there, Billy Rose went to Texas, where they were having a big celebration, the Texas Centennial. And he was putting on 3 shows, 2 shows and a nightclub called the Casa Mañana. And I understand that that nightclub has reopened in the last 5 years. They've redecorated and they've opened. And they had the Aquacade there, which if any of you know the life of Billy Rose or Fanny Brice, that's where he got caught with the showgirl named Eleanor Holm, who was an Olympic champion, and they divorced, Fanny Brice and what I say, Billy Rose. So from there, my dad called us and said, "I decided I'm going to go through Hollywood on the way home, stop out there." He said, because a lot of the conductors that I work with and people I work with are out there in the studios. So he went to California and he went to Hollywood. We used to call it Hollywood Land. It had land after the Hollywood in those days. They don't have that anymore. So he went to RKO Studios, where a good friend of his, Nat Shilkret, a fine conductor, was working, conducting and arranging. And he walked on to the lot, and Nat grabbed him. He said, "Joe, just the person I need." He didn't even know he was there. And pulled him into one of the sound stages, and he said, "You're going to stay right here because we need somebody like you." So my dad stayed. He never did go home even. So we kind of pulled our breath in and decided that we were going to have to go to Hollywood. I forgot to tell you when we bought our first car, but that isn't important, I guess. Years before, as soon as Clara came into the family, she wanted a car. And that's when we bought that, first that Auburn we had that was so pretty. I remember it. It was black and shiny and looked really snazzy. But before we went to California, we bought a Buick. It was blue. We used it out there. And they had it sent out by rail. I suppose it cost a lot of money then. I don't know. So anyway, I should go to where school ends and we all embark for Hollywood. I hope I didn't leave anything important out. But I was at the age 17 about. Don't know exactly. School would end, I don't know. Anyway, I had a year of school. And I went out and we all went. Bob was little. Bob is 17 years younger than I am, so he must have just been walking then. So I have my years wrong, maybe a little bit, but not much. So anyhow, I always say I walked all the way to California because Bob wouldn't sit still. He walked from one end of the train to the other, and I trailed after him. We had a compartment, but he didn't want to stay in there. And I remember we went to Chicago, and then we had to get off and get on another train. Then they started introducing the steamline, what did they call those? Then, like the City of Los Angeles, the new trains that were so streamlined and beautiful. So anyhow, our first stop was in Pasadena after we left Chicago. And I got off the train and I thought I was in heaven. The air was so beautiful and you could smell fruit. I guess oranges, I don't know what, but it was beautiful. I said to Mom, I said, this is where I want to stay out here. It's beautiful. So, of course, I was at the age where I appreciated everything. Everything was very pretty. And we went on, we stayed on that train and we went to Los Angeles. And then I don't know how we got out to Hollywood, taxi, what, I don't know. Anyway, they shipped a lot of the furniture that they wanted to keep and the car to Hollywood, and we got there. And they had rented a house up in the Hollywood Hills that was very beautiful. Had a little brook running along in front, or not a brook, a little something with a bridge over it, and a lot of movie stars lived up there. I could name them, but there's no use. There were so many. And we were right near the Hollywood Dam, and it was very beautiful. And I soon enrolled in Hollywood High School, which was in Hollywood. Now, we were out of Hollywood maybe 7, 8 miles, too far to walk. So they had the big red car in those days, and it was a big streetcar, and I used to catch it. We lived up on a little hill, and I'd go down the hill and catch that car and ride in to Highland, where the school was. And it was a nice school, and it was just crammed with kids. It was the biggest high school. I mean, it was the biggest school of any kind I'd ever seen. And very busy, and every kind of kid was there. We were right across the street from Curry's Ice Cream Parlor, and we would run over there whenever we could, buy a bag of broken cones to eat in class. Anyhow, I went in, and I found out I had to take civics and one other thing, so I had to stay longer than my year. I had to take another half a year or whatever, I don't remember exactly. And Jay went to started school, and Joy was home. And then what happened? I'm trying to think. When I went to Hollywood High, I met all kinds of people, and I had chances for all kinds of boyfriends, and it was heaven for me, because I was pretty social then. So anyhow,
Let's stop there for a minute. During these years, when you were in high school in Bayside and when you went to California, were you dating, and what was your dating life like, and what were the guys like?
oh, I was dating when I was in New York, in Bayside. I went out with a few boys, and then my first date was with a young man named Elliot Miller, who lived in Flushing, which was, like I said, 20 miles from Bayside. And he graduated he was about 2 years older than I was, and he went to Cornell, and he graduated. And as a matter of fact, I went to a weekend at Cornell, what do you call those, homecoming weekend, and it was a big affair. I went up on the train from New York to Ithaca, and they had 2 bands, and one was Cab Calloway, and the other was Benny Goodman, and they took turns playing at the homecoming. It was huge. It was in a big drill hall, and I had a good time. The boys gave us their fraternity house, and they hired a couple of women that could iron our dresses and help us with our hair and this and that. Anyway, that was lots of fun.
You mean all the dates stayed in the fraternity house?
Yeah, the boys moved out and gave us the house. Well, where else would we go? So anyhow, that was a nice thing. So that was all the important dating I had. I had 2 or 3 other fellows I went with, but then...
How did your relationship with this Elliot proceed?
Well, I liked him. He was a nice boy, but I wasn't in love. It was a date. We used to go to the movies when I was first allowed to date. He took me on my first date. And when he went to Cornell, he was very nice, and he was good looking then. And he drove a Chrysler, a nice gray one, I remember. Anyway, it was a nice car for boys in college at that time. And he would come to Bayside, and we'd date. Anyway, when I moved away, he was writing to me, but I had another boyfriend too that gave me a ring, but it wasn't an engagement ring. But I lost that ring, and I didn't care about him anyway. His name was Herb Ferber. So anyhow, I'm out in California now. And Elliot calls, and I talk to him, and he's always there. He's all reliable. And of course, he went into the Army when World War II started, and as a lot of the boys did. So, let me see where I was. I was talking about high school, and I was enrolled at Hollywood High, and I really liked it there. And I went to a couple of dances at some of the country clubs around there, and they were pretty swanky, so I had to have a few formals, and I got flowers, and it was very nice. But I started to get sick. I had a congestion in my lungs, and I went to the doctor. Mom took me, and I had pleurisy, and he said, "This girl has a lot of moisture in her lungs. I want you to get her out of town." My mother said, "Where to?" He said, "Go to Palm Springs." It was pretty small then. Go to Palm Springs, and he said to me, "Don't you lie in the sun. Have an umbrella over you or lie in the shade, but stay out in the warm air." So I guess that's how they cured it then. I don't know. I evidently wasn't ill enough to go to the hospital, but I was ill enough that I needed to do something. So that was kind of fun. A break from school. So we stayed there for a good month. And before we left, I know I went out with a tennis pro there that was 6'6". Can you imagine? I saw us once in a window, a reflection, and I thought, oh, that's terrible. Anyway, I must have gotten better because I didn't feel sick as I had. I had been coughing. And we went back, and I was going back to school, but school was almost over then. I guess I'd missed too much. I'd missed a lot before I went to Palm Springs too. And I said, "Don't make me go back to school." They said, "You have to go to school. You can't go to college." I said, "Well, let me hang around a little bit and take a rest." And I don't know how I did it. I finally talked them into letting me go to business school. And oh, they didn't like that. They thought that was the most horrible thing that ever happened. But I went. In the meantime, I had met another boy and fallen in love. Here we go. I was always falling, but this was kind of serious. This was a family named Perry. My dad used to play twin pianos on the radio with a fella named Sam Perry, who was a good pianist. And he had a wife and 2 sons. And I met the oldest son when I first moved out there, and oh my, he was beautiful. Blonde curly hair and blue eyes and just perfect. So I was very, very much in love for some months till he got tired of me. I think women were always after him. So anyhow, that passed. I think that's what made me get sick. Maybe, I don't know. So anyhow, we're out there and excuse me, I'm going to business school now. The name of it was McKay's Business College. And I was taking computer, shorthand, just everything that had to do with business in the old days and the old machines they had. And it was fun, because there were a lot of kids there that were fun. And we used to cut classes and go to the movies. In the morning, they'd open at 11 o'clock. And we had big stars of vaudeville then that were doing the Keith circuit. And life was just a lot of fun to me then. I hate to think of it now. I probably didn't take advantage of everything like I should.
Okay, so how did things finally evolve with this Elliot then? Was he already out of the picture when you dated your musical partner's son, or was he still around?
Well, the musical partner's son was gone, and Elliot was still there. I always call him Faithful Elliot. And my mom said, "Why don't you take a trip back to New York before you start any schooling again?" So I thought, well, that'll be fine. Of course, Elliot was there, and I think that was on her mind because she liked him a lot. They got along fine, and I think she wanted me to marry him. But I wasn't inclined to get married at that time at all. So I had a trip to New York, and Mom bought me a fur coat, a lovely beaver coat that's still whole, and lots of new clothes, and it was nice. And I remember I had matching luggage, and anyway, I went back to New York, and I stayed with my grandmother and grandfather Nussbaum, my father's parents, and they lived in Astoria, Long Island, which is another little city there. And incidentally, they have movie studios there they're using till this day, I guess. So anyhow, Elliot was around, and I went out with him, and he proposed to me, and I thought, well, nothing's worked out so far. I might just as well. He's been very good. So we went into New York City, and we went to the big jewelry store. Was it Tiffany's or the other one? Let's see. What's the other one? Must have been Tiffany's. Anyway, we went in and picked out a ring for an engagement ring. And that's the ring that he gave me. And then we had a big gathering of all the relatives that could make it on my side and his side at his home. His father was a widower and had a beautiful, beautiful home in Flushing. The father owned a big dairy company, and he was pretty well-to-do. So we had a nice engagement party. I just flitted along, and I wasn't too serious about anything then. I'm sorry, I hate to admit it, but life was just a fairy tale to me, one thing to the next thing. So I kept the engagement ring on and stayed for 6 weeks or so before I went back to California. So in the meantime, they're talking about weddings, and I'm thinking, well, it's all right. If I'd married him, I probably would have been divorced soon afterwards, because I never was deeply in love with him. But he was so faithful and there all the time, and it would have been a nice, easy life. So I went back, and by this time I was pushing, 19 when I got engaged? I can't remember exactly, but I went back, and my folks had moved from the hills where they had their first rented house, and they had rented a house on Crescent Heights Boulevard in Los Angeles, kind of near West Los Angeles. Wasn't downtown or anything. And they were next door to a family, a lady named Catherine Easterbrook, and she had 2 children. And her nephew came to live with her because he couldn't find work in Montana. And his name was John Barrett. And he was gorgeous. He wasn't a cowboy, but he was something to look at and something to talk to. He was the most honest person, no lines, no nothing. He just sort of adored me, and it was nice because I'd had so many shaky things happening to me. And over the fence, we became acquainted. He used to jump over to my side, and we'd play ping pong in the garage. The winner would get a kiss, and a lot of silly things like that you'll probably smile about. But it was nice, and I fell deeply in love. That was the love of my life. And of all things, blue eyes and wavy brown hair, just the right size for me. He was a boxer, as a matter of fact, not a professional, although he did fight in professional. He used a different name of his cousin when he'd fight professionally. And he fought all around the county and in different places around Southern California. And I was still engaged.
Do you have a picture?
Oh, yes. Of John here. This is how John looked. Am I still backward or forward? This is how John looked. This was taken shortly after we married, right after we married. We both looked like a couple of kids, don't we? I guess we were. We were 20, about 21 almost. Anyhow, I get a lump in my throat. I really miss him. So, meantime, I still had Elliot's engagement ring, and plans were loping along there with my mother planning for, my mom, Clara, planning for a wedding. She said, we're going to have a nice wedding, and she didn't know I was serious with John. And when she found out, well, everything hit the ceiling. I know I got out of the house right away. She made me give the ring to her to give to Elliot. And she said, you're in love? She said, with this person's a nothing. I said, well, he's what I want. So I hot-footed it over to my uncle's house. He didn't live in town, but he lived a little out of town. And John said, fine, we'll make do. And we decided to get married. I'd given back the ring, and everything was free and clear, I guess. So I was happy. We didn't have anything. John worked at Douglas Aircraft during the war days, had a good job, but of course, as soon as Pearl Harbor came, he did what everybody else did. He left his job and enlisted, but he didn't want to go into the Army. He wanted to go into the Navy. So we decided, we were married by then. We married in Los Angeles with a judge, you call it a city judge, downtown at the wherever they are, the offices. And that's when this picture was taken. And we decided we'd go to John's birthplace, which was in Red Lodge. So, because his brother Bill was called up to the service. Bill is only 2 years or less younger than he is. So he had been called up too. Now John could have had a deferment, but you know, patriotic John, he wanted to go and do his part. So we went back to Red Lodge, Montana. And I didn't even know where Montana was on the map. I had no idea. I just knew it was supposed to be wild and there were Indians there and so forth, and bears. So we made a trip on the train to Billings, Montana. And there his brother Bill came in an old Chevy Ford and picked us up and took us to, I think it was about 60 miles to Red Lodge. Red Lodge is a little ethnic, I would call it a community. I guess it's a city now. It's very, very small. And that's where John's folks lived. And they were retired at the time, I think. Or Will was retired. Anyway, nice people. And I think Margaret, his mother, didn't know quite what to make of me, but she was very sweet, and I love her dearly to this day. She was wonderful. She was what a mother's supposed to be. So I stayed there for a while. We went to Helena, and John and Bill enlisted in the Navy. And Red Lodge was sort of a wild town. They would have fights on the street, and there was a lot of drinking. And there were, I think they had 17 bars when I went there. It's hard to believe. I don't know how many people were there, just a few thousand, right? And I made some good friends there. There was only one Jewish family in town. Their name was Levine. Esther and, now I can't say his name. Was it Sam Levine? Anyhow, they owned a very nice department store. And we became good friends, and they used to do things with us and take us for rides. Of course, we didn't have a car or anything. We rented a place. And we weren't there for too long, though, because John was in the Navy, and I was alone. And he got sick while he was in the Navy. And I don't know where he got asthma from, because he was a very healthy person. But it was very bad, and I went down and I took Stephen. Stephen, my oldest son, was only 10 weeks old when we went to Red Lodge on the train. And then he was a baby, but I went down to where John was. John was at Treasure Island in San Francisco, which is now a little museum, a naval museum. And he was working and repairing planes that would come in from overseas. And then he got sick. And he got so sick that they had to put him in the hospital. In the meantime, I'd gone down and rented a room in some old Navy officer's house. And there were a few other people there, Navy wives. And it was nice, except John was sick. And he would get a leave every once in a while, and gradually he got worse and worse. The last time that he went back to the hospital, there was a little hill that he had to go up to get into the house to Oak Knoll. So he'd taken the bus out there, and he said I had to practically crawl on my hands and knees to get up that hill. You'd think somebody would have helped him. Anyway, he was so bad, and I don't quite know how they gave him a medical discharge. And I don't know why. Of course, they were going to give him a little pension because he was so sick. And a medical discharge. And so he used to have to sit up in bed at night and couldn't breathe. So we decided to go back to Red Lodge. We had nothing to do in San Francisco. And he enjoyed the Navy while he was feeling well. He really liked it. So we went back to Red Lodge, I guess probably on the bus that time, I'm not sure. We went back the same way we came. And what happened when we went back? John started to improve as soon as we got back to the mountains. Red Lodge is, I think it's about 5,000 feet high. And he started to be a little better, but not quite. So we went to live with his folks. Will, I forgot, Will was still working then a little bit. He was at the mine in what's out of Roundup, Klein Mine, and he was working, getting ready to retire. And there was a wonderful doctor named Dr. O'Neill that was a mine doctor, and he took me under his wing, John and I and Steve. So he always took care of us, didn't charge us a bit of money. Very nice fellow. He's getting his reward in heaven, I think. So we lived with them until, let me see, it was 2 years later that John was born. I'm trying to think in the meantime whether we had John when we went to Bozeman, and he worked for a photographer under the, they used to subsidize the people to take on servicemen and teach them trades and businesses. And I can't remember if we had 2 babies then or just the one. Well, maybe I'll catch up with it. So anyway, he got quite a bit better in that air. Because in Montana was just good for him. So we eventually we had 2 different jobs. First of all, he went to work for a photographer to learn photography. When we came back from California, we had 1 boy, and that was son Steve. And he was born in Cedars of Lebanon Hospital in Los Angeles. And he was a darling baby. Maybe that's why I decided to have a big family. And then in the coming years, after we came back to Montana, I had 5 more children. I had a son, John, born in Roundup, Montana, and he was 2 years older than Steve. Then I had a son, Evan, who was born in Red Lodge, Dr. Kudu. And he was born at home because there was only one doctor in Red Lodge at that time, and he had done a bad job on Will's wrist. Will was injured in the mine, and he didn't do a good job, and his wrist was disfigured, and he couldn't use his hand right. So I had a chiropractor for a doctor, and I had the baby at home. And Grandma Sanderson, who was Margaret's mother, came over, and she got things in hand and brought a lot of sheets, and another lady came and cleaned up the place. And anyway, I had the baby in the house, and the house is still there. We have pictures of it around somewhere. And I don't remember how big Evan was. He was pretty good size, I guess. Anyway, after that, I had 1, 2, 3 children then. I had 3 more children. Next came Bruce, whose home I'm in now. His beautiful home in Missoula. He has a lovely, lovely place with some animals. And by the way, my granddaughter just came into the room. Where are you, honey?
Hi.
This is Gerry Barrett, Bruce's daughter. Isn't she beautiful? Anyway, thanks, honey. I should say more about you, but there's so much to say. She's very perfect in every way that I can see. Anyway, after that, I had I had 5 years till another son, whose name is Mark, and then 5 years more to another son, whose name is Joseph. And I had Joseph enough ahead of, far enough along that my dad had died. So we named Joseph after my dad, Joseph. And that's how I have the big family. I didn't tell you that Evan and John are only 11 and a half months apart. So figure that one out. Anyhow, I was happy with my family. We didn't have much, but we had a lot of love, and I don't know, I think it was wonderful. Everything was just like a storybook to me from when I first came to Montana, because I did all those things I'd read about in my history books. I pumped water. I learned to use an outhouse at Klein at the mines. Everything was new and didn't hurt me a bit. And I'd had a very sheltered life, but it was fun. I liked it. I'm thinking back, and I don't know, it all went pretty fast. Now that I look back on all this time, it was a wonderful time. I have a wonderful family. My boys are all grown, they're grown men, and they're all doing things that they love to do. Of the 6 boys, I have 3 attorneys, Steve and Bruce and Joseph. And I have 2 in the entertainment business, Mark and John. And then who's left? Evan. Evan's been in politics most of his life. Anyhow, they're a joy to me. I'm so happy that I have them, and I'm so proud of them. They're all wonderful people, and they're all kind, gentle people that I love. So that's about all that's happened in this segment of my life. And I had those all in that second time, didn't I? Till I was 30 years old. No, I didn't. Of course I didn't. I had 35 and I had 40. It's hard to keep track. Anyway, I have them. And luckily, they are all well and healthy. And I think it's remarkable.
Grandkids and great-grandkids?
And I have 9 grandchildren, and I have 5 great-grandchildren. Isn't that wonderful? So right now I have a very satisfied look on my face because I'm happy about it.
Show that picture of you and John again.
Okay,
Or show the big one.
okay.
Talk again about.
Here's my husband John. I want you to remember him. He was a treasure. We never went without anything. We didn't have much, but we had enough. And he would do any kind of work to keep everything right with the family. You can just see how good he is and how good he was. Wonderful guy.